Hi Vishnu.
Hello boss, how are you?
ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੱਸੋ ਕੀ ਹਾਲ ਹੈ ਮਹਾਰਾਜ?
Well, good evening everybody.
Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
Everyone.
How are you?
Hello.
Hello sir.
How are you?
Hi.
Hi, Surendra.
Hi. Hi, Shankar. How are you? Nice to see you.
Hi, good to see all of you.
Yes.
Hello. Hi. How are you, sir?
Old friends, so many old friends. Hi, Ashley.
Surendra, hi Shankar, how are you?
How are you?
Hello.
AM.
Let's see. I see out there, my friend Mohammed is there. What about other panelists? General Rajendra Singh is there. Ronan Sen is there. Now I see.
Hi, Surendra.
Hello. Do I have Dr. Tharoor? I don't see him. Can anybody see him? Dr. Tharoor, are you there? Professor Mehta? Professor Mehta?
In attendance, sir.
Hello. How are you? Nice to see you, Professor Mehta. Now, is this Ashley?
Yes,
Hello.
it's me.
Yeah, you are looking so different. You are looking like, what should I say? Other day I had Sadhvi Chari looking just like you.
I promise you, it's only laziness, nothing else, no other explanation.
You are the only person whom we have to wake up early for this.
No, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Yes. Who else? Dr. Tharoor. Hello, Ambassador. How are you? Hi. Definitely, he is good. Now I see Shankar there, Ashley is there, but I must.
Yes, Shashi is here.
Yes. Let me see. Anil, your face is going in a totally different direction.
Surendra, I think you have to mute us all to avoid this background.
I have still people. I have not mute all. I have pressed it 2 times, mute all, and then some people still do it. As soon as Dr. Tharoor comes, we will begin.
He's here.
Where I can't see him.
Just below you on my screen, but he's there, don't worry. He's
Dr.
muted, but there.
Really?
Yep.
Dr. Tharoor, are you there? Hello?
Yes, very much so, sir, for the last couple of minutes.
How are you?
Since 5:58 as required.
Well, thanks a lot for all you to join this virtual discussion on India's foreign policy. Now, we have, I don't think we could have asked for a better panel than what we have today. They are the most knowledgeable, most erudite, most articulate, and most talked about. So I will not really go into introduction. I will not preempt what they will say about foreign policy. As a layman, I can say that in spite of all the problems which we have with China, Pakistan, and let's say with now Iran, and with Nepal and Afghanistan, if you see take a overview, I think we have done prep, and we might have little problems, but problem will always be there. And some of the area, look, US, we have the best relations ever we had. Europe, our relations have stabilized. So is the Russian Federation. In one continent where relations have really drastically improved, African continent. I spent 14 years in Africa. Every country used to say the last prime minister to visit their country was Indira Gandhi, or 30 years, 34 years. But last 6 years, the level of the level of president, vice president, and prime minister to Africa is more than ever in last 50 years. So we have a better relation with, let's say, Gulf country, UAE, for example, Saudi Arabia. So I will not really try to preempt what they are going to say. We will begin the discussion with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. And well, he needs no introduction. You see him on the television, you read his articles, you read his books, and he is a person who is all over. But let me say a few things which perhaps you might have not know. I think he inherited talent for writing in his genes. He started writing when he was 6. I'm told his first story was published in Free Press Journal at the age of 10. Then he did his master's in St. Stephen College, where he was also president of Student Union, enjoyed his debates with Hindu College, and participated in Shakespearean plays. Went to UN, spent 28 years in the United Nations, made a failed bid to be Secretary General, came back to India, joined Congress Party 2009, and now he becomes senior citizen like us, so the media refer to him senior Congress leader. Senior is also in the sense that now he's third time parliamentarian from Congress Party, whose number has been going down. Now, he was Minister of State. I have a special regard for him because he who inaugurated IAFA at ITC Moria 10th March 2010. Though the party's fortunes have been fluctuating, he has been standing by IAFA and part numerous functions which we have organized. I think he, along with Dr. Rajiv Kumar and S.K. Dwar, Gulchand Das, Lalit Man Singh, and Kamal Sibbal, are the ones who might have participated at least 10 times each. So thank you, Shashi. In my view, your legacy in literary field is much larger than the political legacy, which is still going on, is evolving. We have a lot to talk about. Now, I am sure you all know that his book, The Great Indian Novel, it has got 43 editions. I don't know how many books can claim to have 43 editions. It shows the popularity. He also won the Commonwealth Writers Award for this book. Then his book, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, is also ran into several editions. Then I don't know how many of you that when President Clinton came here, in the joint session parliament, he admitted that to familiarize himself with the culture of India, he read Shashi's book From Midnight to Millennium, from cover to cover. It shows the kind of length of breadth he writes. He written all kinds of subjects, non-fiction, and then also he has been writing on recently books like Why I'm a Hindu Way of Life. I think the Sangh Parvar detectives think is a sort of victory for them. They say they forced him to write these books, which he wouldn't have written otherwise. I don't know whether right or wrong. I don't know whether Dr. Sanjay Baru is here or not. Sanjay Baru wrote a book called The Accidental Prime Minister. Sasi went one up and he wrote The Paradoxical Prime Minister. Now the Accidental Prime Minister made to a feature film. I don't know whether any producer is going to put money to make The Paradoxical Prime Minister as a feature film. Perhaps not for the time being. Maybe we will have to wait for long. Now, he has written several books recently. I think Pax India, or Pa India, what you call it, in World in 21st Century. And he is most talked about An Era of Darkness, for which he got Sahitya Academy Award. So finally, all the detectives will have to admit that he is a literary figure of substance. He is the father of the Twitterati in the politicians, because when he used to use Twitter, people used to really criticize him. But then they are all doing what he was doing. And he had at one time more following than Shah Rukh Khan, but now Amitabh Bachchan, Modi ji have taken over. And I think he has done well. Now, he was a little hesitant to begin, but look, having been the chairman of the Foreign Affairs, let's say the Standing Committee of Parliament for External Affairs, and having written a book with I think Samir Saran ORF, The New World Disorder and the Indian Imperative, I think he's the right person to begin the discussion. Shashi, you have the floor. I will request you for the time being, you take your Congress leaders' cap or head away for a time being and give us a very objective, neutral, unbiased assessment of what is going on in the field of foreign policy today. Over to Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you, Surendra. It's very good to see so many old friends on this conversation, and I certainly am floored by your very generous introduction. But in asking me to put aside my political leanings, you are asking the impossible. Still, I will start with two basic positions of principle. When I was chairman of the Standing Committee on External Affairs of Parliament, a position from which I was defenestrated after 5 years last year, I always proudly articulated our tradition that political differences stop at the water's edge, that there isn't a Congress foreign policy or a BJP foreign policy, only an Indian foreign policy. Though the BJP has undermined this principle by abandoning the permanent convention under which the committee was always chaired by a member of parliament from the opposition, starting with Vajpayee Sahib, deciding instead that they want to chair it with a BJP MP, so that's their prerogative, I still hold to this conviction. And the second proposition I want to put before you is that for me, the basic task for India in international affairs is to wield the foreign policy that enables and facilitates the domestic transformation of our country. By this, I mean that we must make possible the transformation of India's economy and society through our engagement with the world. Perhaps you could mute the others, there's various other sounds coming in, my friend. Anyway, the transformation of India's economy and society through our engagement with the world, while promoting our security and our own national values, which in my view include pluralism, democracy, social justice, secularism within our society. So what I expect from my national leaders is that they work for a global environment that is supportive of these internal priorities, an environment that would permit us to concentrate on our domestic tasks, because we are after all engaged in the great adventure of bringing progress and prosperity to 1 billion people through a major economic transformation. And so our foreign policy must seek to protect that development, to ensure security and bring in global support for our efforts to build and change our country for the better. Now, I'm afraid against these two propositions, the BJP's foreign policy report card has largely been a tale of much activity and few results. And like most Indians, I acknowledge the energy that Narendra Modi has brought to his foreign travels. I could only find figures up to June 2018 when he'd already made 41 trips in 4 years to 52 countries. So hugely impressive. But though his tireless energy is admirable, measurable results have been few and far between. Our relationship with Pakistan is rocky, China is pushing us around, ties with the US are erratic, Nepal mistrusts us and is moving towards China, etc., etc. I'll come back to that as I summarize towards the end of my 10 minutes. But the abandon with which Mr. Modi hugged world leaders has clearly not borne much fruit. And as India itself underperformed domestically and internationally, the credibility of the star salesman himself increasingly comes under question. After all, how long can a salesman impress by gimmickry if the package he's selling is empty? The headlines and speeches surrounding his visits and the well-publicized extravaganzas with NRIs and PIOs like Howdy Modi were feel-good bromides that masked a serious lack of a cohesive foreign policy blueprint for the country. I don't know how many of you were familiar with Ambassador I.J. Bahadur Singh's wonderful joke that he told me back in '77 when I was starting out looking at Indian foreign policy. He said, Indian foreign policy is like the lovemaking of an elephant. It is conducted at a very high level, accompanied by much bellowing, and the results are not known for 2 years. I mean, this, for a long while, I argue, was not true. We had actually become much more sprightly and responsive and working at a professional level, but now it's never been truer because everything is at this extremely high level, lots of noise, fanfare, and PR, and no constructive results. And the divisive domestic policies of the government, notably the Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act, aimed at Muslims, which sparked nationwide protests until the COVID-related lockdown shut them down, have seriously undermined India's credibility. Our soft power used to be a major asset. Now, India's stature in the world has never been lower. Even as an opposition MP, I'd like my country to be held in high regard globally as a thriving democracy and an example to the world of how to manage diversity in a free and open society. Instead, the world is troubled by an India that is seen as increasingly bigoted and intolerant, one that is willfully driving sectarian wedges between its people and being overtaken by an intolerant majoritarianism that has no appeal to the world outside. Pick up any major newspaper abroad you like, whether on the right, like the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, on the left, like the Guardian or the Washington Post. They've all published critical editorials about India in recent months. And the drumbeat of daily reporting and the op-ed columns as well are relentlessly negative. So far from having any soft power, the divisive policies of the government have gifted our adversaries, especially China and Pakistan, platforms to attack us. Several world leaders have expressed criticism of our government's recent moves, very friendly ones like the French president, the German chancellor, the visiting Norwegian king. Thanks to the government's dramatic and undemocratic suspension of its autonomy and statehood, Kashmir has been discussed in the UN Security Council after 40 years. Now, for a government driven by and drawing its political capital from its lavishly funded publicity machine, this is becoming a real problem. India, as I've often said, needs to strike a balance between its hard power and its soft power. Not the country with the bigger army that always wins, but that which tells a better story. That was India's big strength in the world. At the moment, the story Mr. Modi and his colleagues in the government are pitching to the world has become less and less convincing. And of course, I respect Modi ji's current foreign minister, who's been foreign secretary for 3 years while I chaired the committee, Jaishankar. And he has famously suggested that India was earlier content with being a balancing power and now is seeking under Modi to be a leading power. But how precisely the Modi government is setting about achieving this remains a mystery. And I'd really like to read Jaishankar's forthcoming book to understand what he means. All we've got is a grandiloquent speech by the RSS chief Mohan Bhagwat, declaring that India is on its way to becoming a Vishwaguru, which a teacher of the world, which embarrassingly summed up both the pretensions and the embarrassment of our global self-projection. We have a government that believes its own press releases, even when those they're directed at ignore them. And the irony is what the world thinks matters more to us now than ever before, not least because we are far more dependent on external support, external trade and investment than we ever were. But foreign investment is an act of trust and of faith in the future, which is fast eroding. Our credit ratings have declined. 7 countries have issued travel warnings about India. The world increasingly sees us as an intolerant, narrow-minded nation in open violation of our international commitments. The one concrete achievement, and I was looking, Surendra, for positive things to say, of PM Modi's foreign policy appears to be that of getting the United Nations to adopt International Yoga Day. Of course, it has meant people around the world following an Indian practice in a visible way. That certainly enhances our image. But the manner in which the government subsequently pursued the Guinness Book of World Records over the issue was, to put it mildly, unseemly. The bigger challenge is the lack of this integrated vision to achieve what I set out at the beginning of my talk. India's foreign policy appears to many observers to be created impromptu on the hoof, as it were, in the course of the Prime Minister's peripatetic travels, the surprise visit to Lahore in December 2015 being a key example of that. Key discussions which should have taken place in the preparation of his visits seem to follow the Prime Minister's pronouncements rather than proceed and justify them. The announcements, usually of investments to come, have largely failed to materialize, especially with China. Meanwhile, the ministries had to swallow the embarrassment of seeing yoga and Indian culture acharyas, well versed in Sanskrit, yoga, and scriptures, appointed with diplomatic status at Indian embassies to promote Hindu culture abroad, even as its core diplomatic staff languishes at levels comparable to New Zealand and Singapore, countries of considerably smaller population and modest global aspiration. The gap between the aspirations Mr. Modi loves to speak of and the capacity of the Ministry of External Affairs to fulfill them has never been more glaring. The red ink on the Prime Minister's report card begins with the neighborhood, which is where any government must act with the greatest caution and sensitivity to balance our national interests with regional circumstances that may be beyond our control.
Keep a track on your time, eh?
I have used up 6 minutes according to my clock so far.
Okay, fine.
Seven. I've got 3 more to go.
Okay.
But I'll do it in 2.5. Since Mr. Modi's swearing in, a pageant of sorts that saw the premiers of Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Afghanistan in attendance, India's ties with them all have witnessed more ups and downs than a child's yo-yo. I wish I had the time to list all the ups and downs with Pakistan, but you're all familiar with them. So too with Nepal, where our de facto blockade choked the nation's economy, cut off its oil supplies, created genuine hardship, and provoked a groundswell of hostility among ordinary Nepalis. Our behavior was a blunder of such Himalayan proportions that the only country on earth whose relationship with us has been fraternal enough for us to maintain open borders with it is now turning towards China instead. And we have a border dispute as well with them. India's mess in Nepal, and until a recent change of government earlier the Maldives, adds to a growing sense that the Modi government's management of relations on the subcontinent is marked by a combination of arrogance and ineptitude. Even with Bangladesh, the heated debates over the Citizenship Amendment Bill, including the Indian Home Minister's description of Bangladeshis as termites, has further vitiated the atmosphere, leading to an unprecedented situation in which the Indian High Commissioner was unable to call on the Bangladeshi president for months, despite multiple unsuccessful attempts. The picture is not much better beyond the neighborhood. The US relationship is totally transactional, but none of the transactions, such as over Iran sanctions or bilateral trade, seem to work out in our favor. European relations are adrift. Britain remains bemused by its dealings with our Prime Minister. Despite a few announcements of aid and trade made during Mr. Modi's visit to Africa for the BRICS summit in 2018, our engagement with the continent has proved to be a sorry tale of high-level neglect. And then, of course, the most glaring embarrassment in our foreign policy has been the disastrous handling of our relationship with China, starting with the fiasco of President Xi's overhyped visit in 2014 and culminating in the complete mismanagement of the military standoff between the two countries, first in Doklam and now the Galwan Valley and the Pangong Lake areas of the LAC. Whatever little foreign policy successes there have been almost entirely in areas where Mr. Modi chose to follow the path already laid by successive previous governments without upsetting the delicate balance upon which these relationships rest. I'll be happy to go address this in the Q&A. To conclude on my 9th minute, Surendra, the cerebral American politician, New York Governor Cuomo, his father, Mario Cuomo, once memorably observed that you campaign in poetry, but govern in prose. Hard reality, he suggested, replaces the flights of policy fantasy that afflict those without power. The video clips of Narendra Modi, the opposition leader, berating the UPA government's foreign policies have come to haunt Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister. While his old poetry was savagely acerbic, the nation has discovered that on the subject of foreign policy, his prose has dried up. Thank you. I'll mute myself now.
Thank you, Shashi, for brilliant opening remarks. I think they are as good as your Oxford Union speech, for which you got 5.3 million likes in 24 hours. Look, your detectors say that when you want to abuse them, and you don't abuse anybody, when you want to make fun of them, you use a kind of English phrases they can't make out. Kettle class was something easy, but now you have gone to kind of the thing which even my attendees won't know. Lalo Chejia, Gonjo, Malleability, and we have heard of democracy and mobocracy, but Sasi has a new word called kakistocracy. I don't know how many of you know kakistocracy. You can find out from him after the meeting is over. Thank you very much. Now I will move to Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta. I'm glad to have him. I have tried for last 3.5 years, more than 6 times. So he's a hard sort of intellectual to come over. He has earned reputation of being the most outspoken and independent mind intellectual. He combined the best of education, the British education, the American institutions, having done his bachelor's from the Oxford University, then PhD from Princeton. And then he was, I think, for a while, visiting professor, assistant professor at Harvard University, and also for a short while at JNU. He was the member convener of the National Knowledge Commission, and he is on the board of governors for International Research Center, vice chair of the World Economic Forum's Council on Global Governance. He's on the editorial board of American Political Science and Review, a journal of democracy. He has written extensively on political theory, intellectual history, constitutional law, politics, society in India, and international relations, international politics. He has written and edited several books, to name a few: The Burden of Democracy, Non-Alignment 2.0, Shaping the Emerging World, India and the Multilateral Order, Oxford Companion, for Indian Constitution, rethinking of Indian institutions, and many more. His articles are carried in the Financial Times, the Daily Telegraph, the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, the Hindu, and the Indian Express. On 5th August, when Prime Minister was doing the Bhumi Puja in Ayodhya, he wrote an open letter to Lord Rama, which only he could do. So, Professor Mehta, field it open to you, and I'm sure you will be as objective, as unbiased, as neutral as you can possibly be. Over to Professor Mehta.
Thank you, Surendraji. And I think the participants will recognize why I was reluctant to come to this distinguished forum. What little I know of foreign policy, I know from many of you around here. But I think this time Surendra Kumarji was persistent, and so it was hard to say no. Okay, so I'll make a couple of prefatory remarks about how does one frame this moment. Then a couple of remarks about what is a fair yardstick by which to judge Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy. And then a couple of remarks about the future. So try and be pretty sort of telescopic. So I think it has to be said in all fairness that if you look around the world, this is an absolutely extraordinary moment in world affairs, where it can fairly be said that there isn't a single major power that is pursuing a policy that is either in its long-term domestic interest or in the interest of making the world a safer or a better place. It's not true of China, which is committing strategic blunder after strategic blunder and certainly is facing a domestic crisis of its own kind. Any country that has to resort to repression, by definition, is facing a legitimation crisis of a certain kind. The United States certainly is in crisis in different ways, both domestically and probably is doing more to take a wrecking ball to the international order than the Chinese could ever dream they would. Right? So by that yardstick, actually India is one of the few sober players left in the international system, not quite drunk and not quite taking a wrecking ball to it. From that yardstick, we are not doing too badly, and that has often been, in a sense, I think India's sort of asset, the continuity of India's foreign policy. Somebody once joked that Indian foreign policy has only two versions. Some is, in one case, you smoke while you pray. In another, you pray while you smoke. You might think the intentions are very different, but the net results are roughly the same. So there is a lot more continuity. The second thing I think about this moment, and I think again to be fair to India in some respects, is that we do have an unprecedented foreign policy challenge in the name of China, and a challenge that the global order must confront in a very different paradigm than it's used to in almost any other conflict. And the heart of the challenge is the fact that China is too big and too enmeshed in the global economy for the world to, in a sense, let it fail, or it's too big to fail, as it were. And yet it has become too roguish for the global system to allow it to succeed. And I think you're finding governments across the world not quite entirely clear on how to, in a sense, handle this dilemma of the consequences of Chinese failure and China going completely rogue in the international system are also, in some senses, too difficult to contemplate. And there are no easy answers to this. I think China has at least helped the decision point of the global system by engaging in behavior over the last couple of years, and particularly since President Xi's ascension, that is leaving the world no choice but to, in a sense, align against it. Yet it is going to be a problem of a very different kind, in some senses unprecedented. So to the extent that we are also not 100% sure about what direction to take, I think it's a dilemma we share with a lot of other powers. Now, coming to India's performance, I do want to stress two things. One, which Shashi very eloquently did, that the best measure of India's foreign policy performance is if it can maintain a healthy and robust economic growth rate and a pluralistic democracy. That is its single biggest asset, and that is an enabling condition for it to be able to do not just anything in the international system, but to be able to acquire the resources and resolve to actually have a nation, let alone a foreign policy. By that yardstick, India is at its lowest ebb that it has been in the last 30 or so years. Growing into the pandemic, our growth rate was dropping to as low as 3%. Now we'd be lucky over the next 3 to 4 years if we average 4 to 5%. And India doesn't have a constitutional democracy anymore. It has an electoral democracy. We don't have a constitution, or if it is, I don't know what it is anymore. So the single biggest asset that India had, which was this absolutely extraordinary human experiment of conducting a deeply pluralistic, energetic constitutional democracy, we have frittered that asset away. And that is going to haunt our international reputation in times to come. I think we are complacent about the damage that is doing. But let's turn to more hard power matters, right? So one of the things that we are taught in IR classes, what does it mean to have a strategy? To have a strategy means to have more options for action, right? More degrees of freedom. Those options can be all kinds. They can be diplomatic options. They can be options to exercise hard power. They can be the options to exercise covert influence, ideological influence of different kinds. Now ask yourself one simple question. Have India's options and degrees to freedom to act in the international system increased or decreased over the last 6 years? Take hard power. This was supposed to be the muscular government. 6 years into its regime, India's defense budget is actually declining in real terms, or as percentage of GDP, not increasing. As the China crisis has brought into relief, and as many other crises have brought into relief, the idea that our hard power options have expanded over the last 6 years is a complete chimera. Arguably, they've actually reduced, and given the kind of colossal failure, even intelligence failure in some senses, that we have experienced in the China crisis, you have to say that even on this own government's yardsticks, have the options that we can exercise militarily, diplomatically, if there is an international crisis, increased? The answer is a resounding no. Right? So it's not clear to me what it means to say that this government has, in a sense, enhanced India's international stature or increased its options. To make matters worse, this government has made India more vulnerable in two very subtle ways. The first one Shashi alluded to, but I think it has even deeper implications than he suggested, which is that foreign policy has become largely a tool for the management of domestic political sentiment. That is its only and single-minded objective. Its objective is not to achieve some external goals. Its objective is not to expand India's development space. Its objective is simply to ensure that the domestic narrative is such that the government doesn't, in some senses, get reprimanded for foreign policy failures. Now, this has unusually politicized domestic policy. It has actually cut down our degrees of freedom because it has created false expectations domestically about what we would do in case India's interests are indeed made vulnerable. Will there be another Balakot? What was that about? Did it actually achieve any real objective it set for itself? Or what it achieved was a domestic political victory? It is very dangerous for a country when the entire orientation of its foreign policy is geared to that single-minded domestic objective. It's even more dangerous when that domestic objective is achieved largely through propagandas and lies. If you look at the history of international relations and great powers, most great powers become vulnerable and decline when their rulers begin to lie to their own populations, lie to the external world, and lie to themselves. We are in an extraordinary situation in India where the basic facts, where is China? What did we know when we did know it? Right? What did the Balakot strikes actually achieve? Who shot down whose aircraft? Just basic quotidian facts that can make for intelligent thinking are not allowed to be broadcast or published. And moreover, with very few exceptions, no one in our public sphere can hold the government to account. Not the Parliamentary Standing Committee, not in any real sense of the term. So a domestic management of foreign policy that is founded not on taking the people into confidence. The people will cut the government slack. They always do. There is huge executive discretion in foreign policy if you take them. But a narrative that is founded on Goebbelsian lies and propaganda, in the long run makes the conduct of your foreign policy much more vulnerable and corrosive than any short-term defeats that you might experience at the hands of external powers. And I think this is a vulnerability that is actually going to haunt us. I'll just end with, in a sense, two quick remarks. I think Shashi Tharoor rightly reminded us that the single biggest test for India's foreign policy is how it manages its neighborhood. If India does not manage its neighborhood well, it will remain strategically tied down, and it not just decreases its options elsewhere, it actually increases its vulnerabilities. Right? What are the cards that China can play within our neighborhood, for example? What are the cards that Pakistan can play? Now, one thing we have to understand, I mean, this every student of Indian history knows, that dealing with our neighborhood is not a classic international relations problem. It is a classic, in a sense, post-reconstruction of a civil war problem. It's not the kind of problem that can be solved by the bravado of unthought of airstrikes, by an escalatory matrix that is drawn from an international relations literature where two grand powers confront each other. Right? It is a problem that squarely lies within the nature of our societies and our histories. And the only true measure of progress of Indian foreign policy is, can we create the room to, in a sense, overcome, I'm not saying undo, overcome, right, the strategic sundering of the subcontinent that happened in 1947. I was a critic of Manmohan Singh, Dr. Manmohan Singh's domestic policies, particularly in UP on many fronts. But the one big truth that he grasped very clearly was that truth. And frankly, I think it's an interesting counterfactual how many opportunities we missed to, in a sense, engage with the subcontinent and get it right. On that front, this government is a walking disaster. It's a walking disaster not because of the way it's just handled Nepal and Bangladesh, but because it has not realized the simple truth that if India is not a zone of freedom and human rights, the subcontinent has no future. We will, in a sense, legitimize every irredentist, fundamentalist tendency in the subcontinent as a whole. There cannot be a bigger foreign policy disaster than this. Last thing on China, I think we were caught unawares, and there has to be accountability for that. I would, however, I think caution against egging the government on into a hasty response to China, as the opposition seems to be doing. I mean, it's an interesting irony where sort of, normally the peace-loving left is kind of egging for some kind of quick confrontation. This is a marathon contest. I think our economic response is exactly right. And frankly, I think there is a silver lining there. I think we'll weather probably the economic costs of disengaging with China, I think, much better than the critics of the government are actually giving it credit for. Right? But I think the assumption, the big signal at the end of the day that the Chinese have, in a sense, got, that when our back is against the wall, India has very, very few options that actually matter in our context. You can build diplomatic coalitions, you can build the Quad, you can do the Alliance of Democracies, you can do all those lovely things, right? But geography matters, proximity matters, the implication of China in our neighborhood matters. And that gives the Chinese so many more options that they could have, in some senses, dreamed of. So given our limited options, I do think the government has, I think it's good that it's not acted in haste, but nevertheless, the net result is that India's truth has finally been exposed, which is it is a mediocre power, not on the rise, but for the foreseeable future, destined to look mediocre. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mehta. You have lived up to your reputation. You check your Twitter account tonight. I don't know how many trolls you will have. You have ruffled many feathers, but that is the business of the academics. Now I will turn to our friend Ashley. Ashley, tell me this, your secret behind your beard. Have you been inspired by Prime Minister Modi? You look like his younger brother, or it is some kind of symbolic gesture to promote the Indo-US cooperation? Well, as you know, Ashley is the right example of Indo-US friendship. Many people remember him as a Bandra boy, having done his BA and MA from St. Xavier College. And people say even that time in the canteen, he used to come with a book and a notebook, and he will, while drinking tea, will make notes. So you can imagine that how studious he has been. Now, he has also done his master's and PhD from Chicago University, for which I have a very soft corner, having done many, many functions. And even now, I organize functions with the International House of Chicago University, whose director is present among the audience today, Dr. Dennis Jorgen. Nice to see you. And I think I have many, many friends there. I used to know Don Randall, the president, Rudolph Lloyd, Susan Lloyd, Ralph Nicholas, and all very good friends. And they have a very nice South Asian Studies department. Now, as you all know, that he is currently Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs and a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, specializing in international security and US defense and foreign policy, with a special focus on Asia and the Indian subcontinent. As a senior advisor to the Undersecretary of the State for Political Affairs, he was closely involved in the civil nuclear negotiations with India. He served as a special assistant to President George W. Bush. Earlier, he was advisor to the US Ambassador in New Delhi from 2001 to 2003. He has authored many books and co-authored several books, such as Interpreting China's Grand Strategy, Past, Present, and Future, Measuring National Power in the Post-Industrial Age, and various editions of Strategic Asia 2010-11, Asia's Rising Power and American Continued Purpose. Speaking at St. Xavier College in 2013, he said, "At last, the world is paying attention on India and interest in India, and India will occupy its rightful place, Committee of a Nation." Now, you have heard eloquent presentations by Dr. Tharoor and Dr. Mehta. You are most welcome to comment on the comment, or you focus on India-US relations. You have plenty on your platter. All the statements are coming from President to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo or Congressmen like Frank Pallone, which are honey to music to the ears of Indian government, Indian audience. But people say in this kind of COVID-19, if you take honey with ginger and lemon every day, it's very good for building up immunity. But you take too much honey, it causes diabetes. So we have to be careful. I have flagged some of these tools which I have in mind. The current EM says that US should learn to live with multipolarity. And you will only know how true it could be. President Trump has gone out of TTP, from the climate change, from WHO, threatening to get out of WTO. In his speech in Davos 2 years back about globalization says it all. So I leave it to you. Focus on India-US more than anything, but you are free to say whatever you want to say. Over to Ashley.
Thank you, Surendra. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion this morning. I must say, I actually feel quite humbled to have listened to both Shashi Tharoor and Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who are old friends, because I think their analytical presentations this morning were really a masterclass in how to think about India and Indian foreign policy. Not to mention, it's also a masterclass in political rhetoric, the way to formulate arguments in ways that are actually attractive and demand, a listening response on the part of your audience. So it was really a wonderful experience the last few minutes. I'm going to follow your orders, Surendra, as you gave them to me, and focus on US-India relations, but not just simply US-India relations. Try to contextualize it in what is a larger problem, at least from my perspective. And I want to start by affirming what I think was the core of both Sashi's and Pratap's presentations, which is that the core of the Indian project, in Nehru's famous words, is to build a just society by just means. And I understand that that is truly what is essential about the Indian idea of democracy, the Indian democratic project, and the very idea of India itself. And to do that, paradoxically, India tried to pursue what was a British Indian strategy, which is to isolate the subcontinent from the external forces of disruption and threat. And that so-called ring-fence strategy really, in some liminal ways, were the underpinnings of India's foreign policy and its grand strategy since independence. Now, obviously, there were challenges because the subcontinent was fractured, there were internal threats, and so on and so forth. But I would argue that India attempted to isolate the subcontinent from the larger politics of the global system in order to create an enclave where its development and democracy projects could proceed unhindered. I see the big challenge facing India today as arising from the fact that that framework has fundamentally broken down. The rise of China, I think, has created a new superpower on India's doorstep. A new superpower within India's region, a new superpower on India's oceanic frontiers. And so India's security space has been penetrated in a way that was not even the case during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the two superpowers were far away. And neither superpower actually mounted manifest threats to Indian security. In fact, the generally good relations that each superpower had with India, except for a few moments in history, gave India the space to essentially play one against the other in order to expand its freedom of maneuver and devise strategies that would help essentially its domestic project to succeed. I see the current moment as being a moment of particular risk to India because one of the superpowers, which is China, is a superpower that is quite manifestly antagonistic to India, and I don't think that is going to change. The rise of China in that sense, not only at India's doorstep and around India's periphery, but fundamentally at the core of the global system, suggests to me that the coming global environment is going to be more bipolar than multipolar. I am not persuaded that the international system of at least the next 2 decades will be a genuinely multipolar system. There will be many centers of power, but the system's overall sort of dynamics will really be defined by the two powers at its core. And as long as that system survives, I think India is going to have to deal with a challenge that it had not dealt with before, which is, what do you do when one of the two superpowers actually happens to be in your very neighborhood, at your very doorstep, and is antagonistic towards you in a way that was simply not the case during the bipolarity of the Cold War. Now, if this is the broad structural environment within which India has to operate, it seems to me that there are two strategies that India can adopt in dealing with this challenge. One is what political scientists call a strategy of internal balancing, which is to essentially build up its capacity from within. And if it does so successfully, to be able to parry the challenging superpower at its doorstep more or less adequately. And this internal balancing obviously has multiple dimensions. It requires India to attain successful economic growth, and inclusive economic growth, because it cannot be just growth, it also has to be development. It requires India to maintain domestic coherence so that its diversity does not become a source of threat, but rather remain a source of strength. And it requires India to complete a regional integration project within South Asia so as to ensure, and I'll put it very boldly and plainly here, so that India's natural preponderance essentially becomes legitimate within the region, and that its natural preponderance does not become a magnet that attracts resistance, but rather compliance. So internal balancing, to my mind, must essentially consist of success along these three dimensions: high levels of economic growth, maintenance of domestic coherence, and a successful effort at regional integration. When I look at the Indian record, I don't think India can claim success with respect to internal balancing as defined in this way, which leads me to the conclusion that the only alternative India has is some kind of external balancing. And an external balancing essentially means some kind of a partnership with other more powerful states that see it in their interest to balance the rise of Chinese power. And the United States is the most obvious candidate for a partnership of this kind of external balancing, simply because the US has self-interest in making certain that China does not get too powerful, and certainly does not become powerful enough to constrain US freedom of action in the larger global system. Now, this is where you run into problems, as I see it. On one hand, India has not managed to complete or to pursue internal balancing as successfully as it would have liked, and therefore is denied the benefits of that option. Whereas on the other hand, India is still deeply ambivalent about the kind of external balancing that it would need to be successful in parrying Chinese aggressiveness and Chinese assertiveness. It's not that US-Indian relations have not improved. They certainly have improved very dramatically in the last 20 years. But it is troubling to many American policymakers. And I'm not talking of the Trumpies. I'll say a word about Trump in a minute. But it is troubling to many American policymakers when they see India's embrace of the United States defined purely in instrumental terms, rather than in more substantive terms, in terms of an enduring affiliation. It's not that the US will not support India even if the relationship is purely instrumental. But I think the enthusiasm with which US support for India will materialize, I think will be in proportion to India's own enthusiasm for the United States. In any event, I think if the relationship ends up being purely instrumental, purely transactional, I think the kind of altruism that I would like to see the US display towards India will become harder and harder to sustain. Now, we lucked out, oddly, in the Trump years for the simple reason that Trump really did not care very much about India per se. He cared about sustaining an animosity towards China. And India was a convenient and useful player in the context of US rivalry towards China. And because Trump did not particularly care for the dimensions about values or the quality of Indian democracy or the quality of India's success, India was just one more chip on the board. And so because we had this abbreviated conception of India in the Trump years, we actually managed to sustain the relationship in better repair than I would have imagined when Trump came into office. Now, I'm not going to look a good thing askance. So I'm happy to take a good US-India relationship, even if it came about for very strange and odd reasons. But the bad news is that this kind of a relationship will be unlikely to be sustained if Mr. Trump is replaced in office come November. I think a Democratic administration will go back to prioritizing US alliances simply out of self-interest, because as American power diminishes, it will require to depend on its allies more than it has ever done in the past. And the fact that India is not an ally is at least going to raise some questions about the kind of support that the US ought to offer India. I think the fact that Trump overlooked many of primarily because of his own sort of lack of political discipline may not persist if you have a Democratic administration in the future. I think it's not the trade irritants per se that gives me pause, but the weakness of our bilateral economic linkages, which to my mind threaten the viability of the relationship. Because you cannot have a strong US-India relationship on the basis of strategic grounds alone if India is unwilling to be a full alliance partner. And if that reluctance to be a full alliance partner is matched by a weak economic foundation bilaterally. You need to have something that substitutes for India's desire to be independent. And ideally, a strong economic relationship would provide that ballast. If Indian democracy were to regain its shine, that would be another great source of strength. But the fact that India has lost its shine in the last few years, I think will become increasingly a source of division between the United States and India, especially if you get a democratic regime that begins to look more closely at the character of Indian democracy. This was an issue that Trump didn't care much about, but his successors might. So I look at the US-India relationship from the outside and see India as being in a somewhat perilous position because it is not in a position to aid the United States materially in what will be a long-term US rivalry with China. And therefore, American incentives to simply double down in support of India for purposes of balancing China, I must say will not be very great, particularly if those diminished incentives are exacerbated by India's economic weaknesses and its fraying liberalism, which, whether we like it or not, is something that is of great importance to key constituencies in the United States, especially on Capitol Hill. So where does all this leave India? To my mind, it leaves India betwixt and between. It's attempting to deal with a long-term challenge posed by China with a very weak hand. A weak hand domestically, because the domestic project has not been as successful as it could have been, and a weak hand externally, because it has partners, but no real allies in the project. And the lack of alliances here is as much because of India's own ambivalence, as well as disruptions that have occurred in the United States and elsewhere in the international system. And while I am more confident that the US will be able to overcome its internal disruptions and play a valuable partnership role to India, I'm not sure the US will be able to solve the incentives problem of why it should partner with India if India's ambivalence about a partnership continues to be the defining hallmark of its approach to the United States. All this leaves me with a very uncomfortable feeling that at the end of the day, whatever India says, if it does not change course in some dramatic ways, either with respect to internal balancing or external balancing, it will have to just come to terms with the fact that it is condemned to remain a subordinate power to China in Asia. And while subordination may appear palatable at first sight, I would say that it has grave consequences for India's autonomy and security over the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. You have ruffled as many feathers as Professor Mehta did, but not only in USA, but India also. I will leave it to the last person, my friend Surendra Kumar, to really address so many points raised by others. But let me introduce Shankar a different way, in a manner in which you might have not heard. I met Shankar for the first time in January 1972 at Rau's Study Circle, Connaught Place. He had long jet black hair, swashbuckling. He had maroon color leather jacket. And 20 years before John Abraham, he drove the Royal Enfield motorbike. In Connaught Place, when a motorbike, you look straight from Marlon Brando in the film called Steed Named Desire. Now, what can I say about Shankar? Shankar got diplomacy in genes. If you take blood tests, you find some description of some diplomacy there. His father was an ambassador. His great-grandfather was ambassador. His uncle was ambassador. Even his father-in-law was ambassador. So you have that kind of, he inhales and exhales diplomacy. If you meet him anytime, you can feel there is a diplomacy in the air. So we can really say that he has distinguished himself. We all know he was foreign secretary. He was a national security advisor. He is perhaps the only Indian diplomat who served as High Commissioner Sri Lanka and Pakistan and also Ambassador to China. Normally, many people have done one posting neighborhood or two, but he has done 3 in a row, and then also decided he was Ambassador to Israel. And he has written book Choices, which was during his tenure at NSA. And he also been a fellow, distinguished fellow, or senior fellow at Harvard, MIT, and now at National University in Singapore. And he writes well. He is always giving his lectures. He takes them very seriously. He has been visiting Professor Ashoka University many times. When I approach him, he said, look, I can't come. I have to prepare for my lecture. But the students at Ashoka University are very bright ones. So Shankar, you have got so many things have been said. You are the right person to address to all them. But I want to more urge you to address to what the new EM has been saying on the eve of his launch of his book. He's talking about either we are game or not we are in the game. We must make choices in a multipolar world. And in the end, he says it's all about getting the right balance. So that is a homegrown, centuries-old line, getting the right balance. That is needed in diplomacy, needed business, needed everywhere. So now over to you.
Thank you, Surendra, and thank you for that introduction, which I must say, it's the first time I've been so introduced. But, you know, speaking after 3 doctors, 3 PhDs. I mean, let me try and simplify what we're dealing with. Let me talk about the situation as I see it, and what we should do to adjust India's policy. Because as everyone says, we are in a very different situation. COVID has accelerated existing trends. We have multiple crises. We have domestic political crises, but we have a whole set of issues to deal with. But what are we actually seeing around us? Ashley assumes we're heading for a bipolar world. So do the Chinese. Now, you would expect the US and China to actually say so, because that naturally suits their interest. EAM says we're heading for a multipolar world. I don't think either of these actually is a full description of the truth. Today, we are between orders. And if you look at the world, it is multipolar economically, but it's militarily still primarily unipolar, driven by the US. And what we have to deal with is a particular problem in our own region, as both Ashley and Pratap have reminded us. But politically, this is a completely fragmented world. And therefore, what we seem to be heading for actually is a system of multiverses, even economically. If you look at it, we seem to be heading towards an RCP in Asia, dominated by China, the NAFTA by a new name in North America, and the EU in Europe. And India has, I think, chosen not to be part of any of these. We still have to make up our mind where we want to be in this new world of multiverses, where each one actually affects each other, but doesn't determine each other's direction. So the world economy today is fragmenting. It's regionalizing, there's rising protectionism, global value chains, supply chains are being realigned, and we are at an inflection point. We are between orders. We've seen the death of traditional multilateralism, and we've seen new authoritarian politics right across the board, which makes diplomacy much more difficult, the give and take that we expect. So what we've really seen is, and most important, as Ashley reminds us, we've seen a fundamental shift in the balance of power. It's the rise of China, certainly, but it's also other things. It's technology, it's a reset in various relationships. It's what the US chose to do over the last 4 years, and even a few years before that, leading from behind, say. So what we've seen, therefore, is fundamental shifts in the balance of power, where around us and in the global structure. So we are in a new situation. I think Keynes once, when he was accused of being inconsistent with something he had said before, he said, when the situation changes, I change my mind. What do you do? So I think the time has come for us to understand that we are at an inflection point. We do need to change our policies. There are some things which we can continue, but I think we need to re-examine what we're doing very fundamentally. And I think this comes through quite clearly from what Shashi said, what Pratap said, what Ashley said. Each of them, the changes they suggest might be different, but basically, so how do we deal with this? For me, there's 3 big things that we have to do. We need a China reset, but a China reset doesn't just mean resetting the relationship with China, which is going to be much more adversarial after what they've done. They've torn up the old agreements, they've changed their behavior on the border, and we will have to do self-strengthening, internal balancing, as Ashley says, and we will also need to do external balancing, whether it's with the US, with Japan, with the Quad Plus, and so on. I think China-US contention is now a structural fact of life for the foreseeable future. And this actually gives us some play. And the problem is, to my mind, that India-US relations might be better than they've ever been before, but they're also much narrower than they've ever been before. We used to say it's based both on principle and on interest. But the commonality of principle, at least on what used to bind us in terms of values, democracy, etc., that is no longer so evident on either side. And the economic basis, which was supposed to drive the transformation of relations, that has also become much more contentious as both sides become much more transactional in their approach. So you're left, therefore, with primarily a defense, intelligence, security relationship, a Paul Mill relationship, so to speak, with China, the greatest contributor actually to good India-US relations. But that's not a satisfactory basis for a long-term partnership or for deepening the partnership. And as Ashley says, the course of US politics can make that much more complicated. But we do need a whole set of policies around the rise of China, which is more than just dealing directly with China or strengthening ourselves on the border, etc., improving intelligence and so on. The second thing that I think is critical to what we need to do is the integration of the subcontinent. And this includes three parts to it, where ultimately the goal should be that we are seen as a source of stability in the subcontinent. I differ with Ashley in the sense that I don't think we ever thought we could follow British policy of ring fencing the subcontinent. I mean, the Cold War might have had its main focus in Europe and gone elsewhere, but we knew after partition that the subcontinent was no longer a cohesive strategic unit. And we knew that once China came into Tibet, that the ring fencing was no longer possible. So I don't think that is really where we're coming from. And I don't think that's where we should be going either. But what we do need to do is to make sure that India is the economic hub of the subcontinent and that we are a net provider of security and seen as a source of stability by our neighbors. I mean, that's very important. And I think it can be done. I mean, we have come close to it at various stages, but the moment we export our domestic divisions and try and use foreign policy for our domestic internal party political purposes, call Bangladeshis termites, for instance, that's the end of it. Then you cannot have a reasonable or successful subcontinental policy if you're going to let domestic politics drive it. And that, I think, is something that we need to not just understand, but also to educate our political leaders about. Third part of it, I would say, is get an economic policy, because we need to adjust to a fragmenting and slowing world economy. And just saying self-reliance or going back, which God knows how far it goes towards autarky, is not the answer. We walked out of the RCP at the last stages of the negotiation. What does that tell the world? It says that we do not think that we will be competitive for the next 20 years, and it guarantees that that is so. It's also a bet on an Asia that is not Asia-Pacific economy, that is not China-centered, which I'm not sure is the smartest bet to make at this stage. We need a trade agenda, we need a trade policy agenda, but we have fundamental issues here which start at home and can only be solved at home, not by running away from negotiations and the world. Factor market reforms. I mean, land, labor, capital, you know, you need a competition policy at home, because that antitrust at home makes you competitive abroad. The Chinese attitude is rather like the attitude of the big four tech companies, you know, FANG. Their model is simple. Winning for them means dominance. It's not the efficient use of capital. And I think we have to adjust to that new world which we're going to see around us. So what does all this add up to? It adds up to, and for me, it adds up to a different kind of diplomacy where credibility is the key. And that's the biggest thing that we've lost. I used to say to our probationers always that the one thing a diplomat has is his credibility. It's the most precious weapon you have. And I think it's time we got away from this personal diplomacy. We stopped bad-mouthing previous governments, that we actually built consensus within ourselves. Of course, we need to, as Shashi said, empower MEA through institutional changes and so on. But I do think that a little humility will go a long way. It's much harder to make policy in this situation today, but we need to keep our eye on the ball. Forget the distractions. There will be elections in the US every 4 years. There will be all these kinds of things, but we need policies, not schemes, not slogans. You know, and foreign policy is ultimately national. The more we make it party political, as the Modi government has done for 6 years, the less effective it is. And we can see the results on the border with China. We can see it in the subcontinent. We can see it in our economic engagement with the world. It's a law of optics that, Venkat used to remind us that the image cannot be better than the object in reality. And the Chinese, I think, are learning this. They spend over $20 billion on their image abroad. And they're more isolated today than they ever have been, and they have a worse image today than they have had since the Cultural Revolution. And I think that should be a warning to us, that that's not the way to go with our diplomacy. So it's not about fine words, it's about credibility, a little humility, working in our neighborhood, and getting an economic policy that works in today's world. That, for me, is the best way to deal with the rise of China, which is our biggest challenge. I'll stop there, and maybe we can go into this in the question and answer.
Thank you, Shankar. I was right to give you the last word. You addressed so many points. Little humility will go a long way. Humility is missing in many areas. Credibility is also missing. Well, we have overshot our time, but I will take one or two. I see in the audience attendees the current chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, Ambassador P.S. Raghavan. Raghavan, do you want to ask anything? Is Raghavan there? No. Then I have Suhasini Haidar from Hindu. Suhasini, you have long interest in diplomatic relations. Do you have any question?
Thank
Yes,
you. Thank you for including me in the conversation. I wasn't expecting to be called on. But I do want to know, and this is pertinent to both what Mr. Tellis had said, as well as what Mr. Tharoor is saying, and Mr. Menon and Dr. Mehta as well have said. The question really, that India essentially is still pretty much walking down the middle. And I think that comes very clearly from what everyone has said. And I think External Affairs Minister, as Jai Shankar, saying that India has never been, nor will it ever be part of an alliance system, is a very telling comment. My question really is, given that that is India's policy for the foreseeable future, do we really actually see, the idea that today's policy is dramatically different from the rest seems to go away? And whether we call it multipolarity, whether we call it, issue-based coalitions, is it not just a sort of a bit of a sameness to a term I'm scared to use, but seriously non-alignment?
Who will take it? What about Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Shiv Shankar Menon? Shashi, you want to say something, please?
Yeah, I know. I just unmuted myself. So I was saying that I don't demur with Suhasini's comment. Look, I mean, listening to all the others, I think broadly speaking, we're all in the same place. I don't see any enormous differences of either substance or analysis in the approach of the four of us. And as far as Suhasini's question, if I understood it properly, I had a brief distraction during her question, so I was a bit taken aback when you saddled me with it, was that if we are looking at the way in which our own policies at the moment have to be oriented. Suhasini, if I've got the thrust of your question wrong, let me know. I would simply, can you, Suhasini, just repeat the...
Question is maybe it's just a rhetoric one, but from everything that you've said and Dr. Mehta, in fact, what Mr. Tellis has said as well, what seems to be very clear is, despite the worries about India's internal situation and domestic policy impact on foreign policy, neighborhood, and all of that, if actually at the end of the day, we are still talking about not being part of an alliance system, and External Affairs Minister Mr. Jai Shankar was very clear that India will never be part of it. Are we essentially just skirting around the idea of non-alignment still? Do you think that that is still the only thing driving long-term foreign policy?
No, I advanced, I think you know this, Suhasini, the concept of multi-alignment is my contribution to that particular debate some time ago when I suggested that in the present world, which is very much a networked world, rather on the pattern of the World Wide Web, that we were essentially functioning in a situation in which we would have multiple relationships with multiple countries, multiple partners for different purposes. And that these did not necessarily have to take the form of locked-in alliances, that we could be very close with the US on some issues, very close with China on some other issues, and very close with both of them, or taking one side against the other, depending on the issue. Now, this proposition, I think, remains. I mean, the obsession with strategic autonomy may well have gone too far, but at the same time, since we've heard from Mr. Modi's foreign minister that alliance is out of the question, it hasn't totally surprised me, because the thinking in India appears to be that we can actually try and keep having it every which way. That is, that we can, for example, enlist the Quad countries as partners in a sort of robust resistance against Chinese adventurism on our borders, while at the same time preserving enough of a relationship with China on trade and investment and collaboration and multilateral institutions and so on. That's been the thinking. Now, obviously, all of this is up for grabs right now. No one knows how this very tense and fraught border situation is going to evolve. It could well put us in a position in which we have no choice but to fall into the arms of others and take an overtly anti-Chinese position. There's even some prospect, according to some perhaps alarmist analysts on the border, of armed conflict. And for that reason, I think that it's important for us to keep these options open. But if I were to summarize the orientation of the Indian foreign policy establishment as I glean it, it would be to try and preserve as much of India's freedom to demur, the use of the word partnership rather than alliance, and that there would be an inclination in this case to lean towards the US when it suits us and to lean in other directions when it does not. I don't know, Shankar has been in the foreign ministry for all his adult life, and I think he may well have a different take on this. So have many others listening in, but I don't see us leaping into an alliance pattern either.
Okay, Shankar, you are here.
I have a very simple response to that. After all, what are we talking about here? We're talking about an alliance with the US. There's nobody else that we're talking about here. And where is our common interest with the US? We have almost identical interests in the whole maritime domain, the Indo-Pacific, in making sure, which is now contentious. I mean, China's coming into the Indian Ocean, et cetera, et cetera. And we will work with the US, whether that involves signing agreements, doing various other things which go with an alliance. I think we'll do that. Secondly, what happens, but our problem is we're also a continental power. We have a problem with China on land. The US is not going to get involved in a continental war anywhere here. That's what an alliance means, right? That they fight to defend your territory with you. They're pulling out of Afghanistan. Eurasia, the landmass of Eurasia is being consolidated by Belt and Road, various other means. Even the Russians feel they have no option but to work with China. You need to find a continental strategy that works for you. As your relationship with China gets attenuated over the future, as it gets more and more adversarial. I mean, that's the way I see it. And that's something none of us has actually come up with yet. Nobody in India that I have seen or outside has actually come up with a reasonable, practical, continental strategy for India to cope with what's happening around us. And I don't think, frankly, that even an alliance with the US is the answer to that problem. Maybe you need 5 different bits of answers, but that's the way I would frame the problem for us. So alliance, it's just a tool. If it works for you, use it. But if it doesn't work for you and doesn't solve all your big problems, then don't use it. But there are other ways. There are things as good as alliance or even better. I, of course, have my mantra, which is issue-based coalitions of the willing. Each one of us has our own mantra. I mean, Shashi, you just heard Shashi's. And every government of India will come with a new mantra, by the way, because they all want to say we're better than the last ones and we know how to do this. This is a democracy. But that doesn't matter. The fact is, it's true. We have had continuity, but it's time for a break now.
We are running out of time. Ashley, you want to add something? Do you have any mantra of yours?
You know, I wanted to
listen, no, I'm already overshot. I don't want to take all this. Let us just finish with this question. Yes, Ashley.
I just wanted to add one thought. I mean, Shankar, I think, put his finger on it. The heart of the alliance question is whether there is a commitment to collective defense. If the US is not committed to collective defense with India, whether it's on the continent, whether it's in the maritime space, then obviously there is no further point in talking about the prospect of an alliance relationship. But I would argue that that question has never been tested. We don't know. And there is much that the US can do to help India beyond simply providing troops along the Sino-Indian border, right? There's space, there's intelligence, there's air power, all of which can have terrific impact on a continental balance without having to put troops. So it comes down to a very simple question to me. Why would it be in America's interest to provide those capabilities to India if it does not feel that the quality of the relationship it has with India warrants those commitments? And so the real debate is about what is the quality of the relationship we want to build, whether we call it an alliance or not. And I think that is still a work in progress. But to the degree that we don't answer that question, I don't think we can get the kind of partnership that makes our contribution worth the money.
Well, Professor Mehta, can we end on some positive and happy note? Some positive. Where do you see India after 5 years?
हस्ती मिट्टी नहीं हमारी.
हस्ती नहीं मिटती हमारी, सदियों रहा है दुश्मन दौरे जहां हमारा, अलम अखबार है said right. Well, thank you very much, all of you. It's wonderful. We are not Carnegie, we are not Brookings, we are not ICW. It is being done from my little apartment in Mayur Vihar. But thanks to friends like all of you. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Shankar. Thank you, Shashi. Thank you, Professor Mehta. And I think you have given a lot of food for thought. Look for your comments from your friends, admirers, and others on your Twitter, and maybe tomorrow some headlines. Thank you very much, and good night.
Good night. Thank you.
A round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.